I don't know, is this rated G? Or,
I mean, if you want to use swear words, I'll have.
And one day I went up to the Soaring Society and I said, hey, excuse me, I just wanted to talk to you for a second about your flight path because it's going over our house and I don't think that's correct. Didn't even turn around. He just said, F off, I'm busy. All right, so that's one response. And there was a letter in the Boulder Weekly about 3 years ago. A guy wrote, I just bought my 1967 Piper Cub and the county is thinking of getting rid of leaded fuel. How am I going to fly my airplane? Don't they know that I need to get the upper cylinder head lubrication from the lead? And, the concept of the right to fly is so entrenched. And also there's kind of an idolatry that goes with the flying, like up and away to the wild blue yonder. And
there's a lot of people moving through life who think their exhaust don't stink.
And he wrote, I'm quoting, Santa Monica got permission from the FAA to close its airport because of the safety and hazards having all the airplanes there because, they're just up the road is LAX, there's Hawthorne, and these other airports, and that's why the FAA is allowing Santa Monica to close. All right, so I read that. I didn't send Bob an email or a request, so I called John Fairweather, the lead activist at Santa Monica, and I sent him, the quote, and I said, John, can you comment on this? And he said, this is 100% false. There is no evidence for this, and furthermore, the FAA never takes care of congestion by closing the airport. They just reroute the airplanes. But they have never once closed an airport because of congestion. The FAA fought this up to the last minute because it was getting ready to go to trial in the county where Santa Monica is located, and they did not want to lose a case. And so they said, all right, you can shut down your airport.
We ain't throwing starfish here, now we're having a good party. Talking about structural change. We believe the land is sacred, even beneath that vacant parking lot, where the weeds are doing their best to express the need for something different. Gonna make some space for you and me to live here all together. Gonna make it safe and fun for kids to get around the town. Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 54, I interviewed Hep Ingham, who is a concerned citizen living east of the Boulder Municipal Airport and is frustrated with his aviation enthusiast neighbors. We talked about the dangers of breathing lead nanoparticles and the Reed-Hillview Airport lead study, which showed the harmful effects of children living near an airport similar to ours. We also spoke about pilots who don't follow flight path rules, the impossible task of getting federal bureaucracies to hold them accountable, and the legal challenges around closing our airport, among other related issues. I know Hep through my involvement with the Airport Neighborhood Campaign, and admire his thoughtful, no-nonsense approach to explaining issues and his tenacious advocacy for getting lead poisoning out of our skies. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Hep Ingham. Hep, welcome to Sharing Boulder.
Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, thanks for making time for this. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Hep Ingham, born in Boulder in the late 50s. Left in 1976 after high school. Came back 85 to 89 working at the Bureau.
Which Bureau?
Bureau of Standards,
okay.
Which is now NIST. And my colleague there, Jerry Strady, owned this house out here east of the airport and the pasture across the street, which is referred to as the Klein-Strady pasture for OSMP now. And I used to come out and help him in the 80s with his cows. And I stayed in touch with him. And 21 years ago, I came by to say hi, and he asked me if I wanted to buy the place. I bought it, but I was working in San Francisco, and I stayed out in the Bay Area. And my wife came back in about 2015 to start working on the house to remodel it. And I didn't come back for more than a weekend until March of 20, when the virus hit. And that's when, after the airplanes started coming back, is when I first started to notice the low flights and the increased number of flights. So to answer the question, why did I move out here? Well, it wasn't really a problem when I moved out here, because first of all, I didn't study it.
But to be clear, you knew there was an airport here when you moved.
Sure, I used to wash airplanes up there in 1973 when I was going to Centennial.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So I know all about the airport, but yeah.
All right.
So it isn't it's not like it was something that I knew about and understood and then decided to fight it.
Yeah.
It's more that, I was given an opportunity to own this house and we took it. And I should say that this house was built in the 1880s.
Long before the airport.
The airport was built in 1928 and became a municipal airport in 1948.
Yeah.
So I've got about 60 years on the municipal airport of this property. And we can go into the logic of how an airport confers rights to people and why a property similar to an airport does not confer rights. But maybe we can talk about that later. But
all right. Well, I mean, we could dive right in.
Yeah. Okay.
Or whatever you want to do first.
So let's just kind of go through the process. So after the airport started to kind of come back into business after the virus hit, one of the first things that I noticed were some hang gliders, not power gliders, whatever they are, with the motors on them. It came through and the people were rubbing their feet in the top of our cottonwood tree and driving our dogs wild. And our livestock, they were going crazy. And so I called up at the airport and I said, what's going on here? I've got people taking off from the airport, coming right over our house, rubbing their feet in our cottonwoods. And so the answer I got, this is when Yates was mayor.
And you're just calling, you don't have any relationship with them at this point. You're just calling to be like,
yeah,
hey,
why are these people flying right over the top of our property at about 80 feet high in these ultralights? And I don't think John Kinney was the manager yet. I don't think they had a manager. So I called the airport line. There's no answer. So I call up the transportation line, Department of Transportation, and then they send me an email saying the FAA controls the airport. The city has no control over what the people using the airport do. So you are welcome to write the FAA and take your complaint there. And so right away I see, all right, this is a bureaucratic nightmare, because why doesn't the city say anything about its airport? So I looked up online and I looked up what their rules are for departure heading east, because I'm east of the airport. And there's a departure standard there, and it says all planes must travel straight till they get to 7,500 MSL or 7,800, whatever it is.
What's MSL?
Mean sea level.
Okay.
So basically
2,500,
yeah.
2,200.
Do not turn over the houses that are east of the airport. So there's this huge gap here between our house and the next house. It's about 1,500 feet. And, and it's, some of it's open space, city, some of it's county. And then there's, commercial buildings over here, Keeter Trucking. Then there's the Keeters have a quarry, and then there's Pioneer where they sell raw materials like landscaping materials. And there's a couple houses over there, but those are on Valmont, and so there's really nothing between me and Valmont. And so, then I started to notice that the tow planes towing the gliders were coming over our property. Some would come over the top of our house. And so I'm looking at the rules again, and it says, they should follow the center line of the runway till they get past the airport. So I mapped it out on Google. I drew a straight line on the airport. And the center line of the 8G runway, because there's 2 runways up there, there's actually 3, but the 8 is for power what they call the power runway. So those are regular airplanes that aren't taking a tow plane. And the 8G is the glider runway. And that 8G glider runway, the center line of that is on the border of the south of our property, which is 425 feet south of where we're sitting right now. The end of the runway is about 1,100 feet from where we are. So, looking at percentages, even if you account for error or wind or something like that, you're 400 feet out of 1,000 is your error by the time they get to our property. That's a 40% error, and that's the competency and the statistical margin. It should be much lower than that. And I think the FAA has a thing they call dynamic range, that you can deviate from the center line during your takeoff. I don't know what that is. I think it's 125 feet. But anyway, so the airplanes have...
Yeah, I mean, you have to try to come over the house.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I went up there and across the road, and I walked up to the end of the runway, which is at the end of the Klein-Strady property. And I just stood there and I watched them come up, and the tow planes, as soon as they take off, they start to veer towards the north, taking a left, and then they head straight over our house. And all right, so that's sort of the physics of it. Is we're here.
That's the layout.
Our house is 500 feet from, or 425 feet from the center line, and that's way bigger than they need to for their dynamic range for keeping it on the center line.
And I'll just point out that it's going to be loud if they go over the center line, but the way acoustics work and sound, it's all kind of exponential decay,
Yeah,
so the difference between them coming over the house and going 400 feet that way is huge.
It's very large.
Yeah.
And we can get into the comments I got. So, all right, so that's the physics of it. So I'm watching these guys, and I get this message from, the city saying there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
So I said, all right, let me go up and ask them to follow the rules. So I made up a map. I had our house on here. I showed the airport. I showed the center lines for the 8 and the HE runway, and I made copies of it. And I went and talked to every pilot that I could find up there for over about a 2-month period. Very respectful. I went up, said, hey, I live east of here, and your airplanes are coming over the top of our house. And you should, Boulder says you should be on the center line. And so I handed it out, and some guys said, all right, let me try. I don't know, what is this, rated G?
I mean, if you want to use swear words, I'll have.
So I went up and talked to him, and I met all the glider pilots, and I just showed them, and I tried. And one day I went up to the Soaring Society, and I said, hey, excuse me, I just wanted to talk to you for a second about your flight path, because it's going over our house, and I don't think that's correct. Didn't even turn around. He just said, F off, I'm busy. All right, so that's one response. The other answers I got were, we can do whatever we want on takeoff. It's the airport was here first. One guy told me, well, you took a risk driving your truck up here, so why do you care about us flying over your house?
You took a risk driving your truck up?
Yeah, because I drove up. Yeah, so I drove my truck up there to talk to them, and I was talking to the lady.
What's the risk involved in talking to people?
The risk in driving. I put myself at risk.
I see.
By being in my truck. And
sure.
So he's equating me driving there with them flying over my house with their airplanes. And so, so then I looked up the FAA regulation, and it says, you in sparse, so the most lenient rule would be in sparsely populated areas, you must maintain at least 500 feet when you're going over someone's house, and you should not fly over people, or structures. And it says only when necessary during takeoff and landing should you go over a structure, when necessary. So I went up and asked them that, and I said, here's what the rule says, only when necessary. And like the lady that is the manager for Mile High Gliding, she says, I said, so what's necessary about you guys coming over my house? He said, I don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? I mean, this is an FAA rule.
And they feel very defensive about it, right?
Not really.
No. Okay.
No, they're very confident and very sure about themselves. And they said, no, I can't answer your question. I said, well, then why are you doing it? And she said, I don't know. And so I said, all right, I'm going to call the FAA. And so I called the FAA and I talked to Jeff Epperson out of the Dallas office. And I said, look, these airplanes are coming over my house and they're 200 to 350 feet right above our house. And all of them are above our pasture. Some are right over the home. He said, well, that's a flight safety violation because if they were to have a power plant failure, then they might run into your house, and they shouldn't be doing that. He said, I'll get an investigation. I'll arrange an investigation. I said, all right. So, 3 or 4 months go by. So it's the summer of 20. Now we're into 21. Nothing's really happened. So I'm starting to bug them. I said, look, I ended up talking to a guy named Mike Lytle, another investigator at the FSDO, Flight Safety Denver office. So it's called FSDO. So I give him the story, show him the maps, show him the traces that I have from ADSB.
Yeah, I'll just point out that you don't like an investigation doesn't involve people on the ground watching airplanes take off.
Well, it could.
It could, but also like all the flight data is available, all the traces.
Yeah,
on that.
and so
Easy to look up.
And they have the radar there that they can track the airplane about every foot.
Yeah.
The ADSB is like every 50 feet. So, the radar they have at Stapleton, they can track everything. So I talked to him, and he said, yeah, no, I'm going to get Brian Richards out here to do an investigation. Another couple months go by, nothing happens. So I said, what happened? Where's the investigation? They're still coming over our home. And so they set up a meeting. I finally get an email from a guy named Adam Henderson and Jay Denkoff. And they set up a Zoom meeting. And this is December of 21. And so we have a Zoom call. I'm at my office in San Francisco. And so I show them my pictures. And I say, here's where they could fly. They don't have to come over my house. And they could make their turn out over the open space pasture. There's no houses over there. Right now they're flying over 2 schools, a bunch of houses, and all these farms to make their turn. And then they come back over our houses on their way back. So they make a loop. And he says, well, that we haven't authorized that. I said, well, why not? I mean, they're violating your altitude standard. So Jay Dankoff says, well, I don't understand what's going on here, because if they're on the ground, they're at 0 altitude, and then they have to take off. They have to come over your house. I'm like, Jay, because we're on a first name basis, and so I'm Jay. There's 2 dimensions here. You got altitude and direction. Why are you leaving direction out? He said, I don't understand what you're saying, and it was very bizarre. And so. So then Adam Henderson brings up the data that he has from Stapleton, and it shows and I'd sent them tons of traces.
So Jay's reasoning is like, well, by the time you get to here, you can't be more than 250 feet up or whatever. Well, that's it. I mean, that's it.
He doesn't understand that they're not flying on the center line. So,
right.
And I said, Jay, they should follow the center line. And he just said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he was
That's just
baffled.
Okay.
And so then Henderson brings up the traces, and he shows 2 traces. He shows 2 flights, and I've sent them about 50 traces where they're coming over the property, and maybe 15 where they came over the house. So he picks 2. They're at the very south end of the property, just right at the center line of HE, and they're at 850 feet. And these are not even tow planes. These are powered planes that are taking off from the 8G or from the tramp runway, which is the grass runway in between the 2 paved runways. And so he takes these 2, and then I said, Adam, you are cherry picking the data. That's dishonest. And so his response to me was, you can continue to file complaints with the FAA, but it is not in the public's interest for us to spend any more time answering your complaints. And so after I said, I was just kind of shocked. I mean, first here he lied by cherry picking, and then he snowballed me. So I got steamrolled, and then I got snowballed, and very dishonest. But but as you get into this, you find out this is very common. So anyway, I wrote him an email, and I said, "Why did you cherry pick the data?" And he just repeated the same thing about it's not in the public's interest. So I wrote him again. I said, "Well, you're steamrolling me, and you're snowballing this. Not snowballing, a different word. Stonewalling.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're preventing this investigation from happening. You never did an investigation, and now you've just cherry picked the data." And so now I know about the FAA, and then then about that same time I started doing some searches, and I met Bree Lehman. I ended up connecting with Kim Gibbs. She had a lawsuit against the FAA in 2016, and it's and what you find out is this is how the FAA treats everybody on the ground, every single person. There's not one exception in the whole country. Everything is, if it doesn't affect flight safety, we don't care about it, and we're not going to spend any time talking to you. Yeah. In so many words, they may say it nicer or be nicer. And I think the best example was upstate New York from 2012 to 2018. A guy had a beef with a lady at a restaurant. The lady owned the restaurant. He came in there, and she threw him out, or wouldn't answer his business. And so he started using his Cessna to dive bomb her restaurant and her house, going under 200 feet. And so she complained to the FAA, and she complained to the FAA for 4 years. And finally, the city was getting sick of it because it was bugging everybody now because her restaurant was in this little city. And they finally just said, "You know what, this is ridiculous. The FAA is not going to do anything." And so they just said, "All right, this is harassment." And they just used regular county sheriff rules to approach the guy. And he landed his airplane. 2 sheriff deputies grabbed him, handcuffed him, and they said, "You're guilty. We're arresting you for harassing this lady and the town." And they threw him in the jail. He got bail, and he went to court, and he got found guilty, and he spent either 6 months or a year in jail.
Wow.
And his plane got towed away, and
I was worried you were going to tell me that the FAA swooped in and defended him or something like that.
They kind of did, because they defend by omission, because they won't participate. They won't enforce their own rules as how the planes affect the people on the ground.
Yeah.
And then, so then I said, "All right, I'm in this now," and I met Kim Gibbs. She had a hell of a time trying to defend herself in Longmont. And she was going against the flight parachuting school in Longmont, because they have a plane called the Twin Otter, and super loud. And it's a thing they do is where they feather back the pitch on the blades, because you can do that with this modern type of an airplane, and they can spin them much faster. And what that does, it makes the tips of the propellers hypersonic, and it makes it very loud. And so they started to circle her house in this high noise mode to attack her. And so she went to the FAA to try to defend herself, and she filed a suit going through the FAA using the administrative judge that was assigned to the case. And, she got all this evidence. She had video evidence, audio evidence. She had a whistleblower. She pulled evidence from the internet, these guys posting things about her. She had a notice taped to her front door that said, "Enjoying the noise from our airport," taped to her front door. So
and this isn't upstate New York. This isn't Longmont.
These
are our neighbors. Yeah. Okay.
And so and like somebody posted on one of the pilot chat boards, which she presented in court, so it's a part of the public record. So some guy is replying to this guy talking about the case. He said, "I'm going to give her a blowjob with my propeller." So there's this kind of attitude that a lot of the pilots have, and it's, and it's my opinion that it comes from the fact that they don't have any rules containing their behavior.
Adult supervision.
And so it selects for a type of personality that doesn't care if they bug people or are aggressive or retribution or vengeful. It selects for that type of personality that likes that. And so she lost the case because the administrative judge came up from Colorado Springs and said, "All right, I'll come up and if there's any airplanes over your house, and I'll do something about it." Well, there wasn't a single airplane over her house that day, not a single one. And to put a cherry on it, the FAA created a new flight path for airplanes leaving RMMA, and they put a pin drop on her house in Heatherwood, and this is the FAA, an official document saying, like, if you need to go up to Vance Brand from RMMA, fly over this point. And they put a pin drop, and they have like a high resolution satellite photo, and then they got a thing right there. So that was Kim Gibbs, and so I kind of know what the consequences of taking on these people was going to be. And I think it was in 22 in the fall, there was a wreck down at RMMA. A guy.
Which year?
2022.
Yeah, this is at the corner of El Dorado and Interlaken, maybe.
Yeah. So
I had to bike around that because I worked down there. And
okay.
It was a really weird day for me because on the day before, there had been a bus accident at the bus stop where I wait for the bus. Mm-hmm. And if I had been waiting for the bus, it was like some weird thing where there was a big crash and they had to replace some stuff. And then the next day, I had to bike around a plane accident to get to work. The guy crash landed, burned up in flames, and my colleague actually saw the plane land.
So
land. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So so that plane wreck. So Kim Gibbs gives me a call and she says, Channel 9 wants to interview somebody about the plane, the planes flying off course, and the danger it is to the public out there. I said, well, I really don't know anything about it. He says, well, I'm in Florida, can you do it? I'm like, oh God, all right, this is it. Now I'm in it. So I said, all right, I'll do it. So I go down there and I meet with Channel 9. And so I get down there and we're standing by the crash site. And, all I know it's a west wind, and looking at where he crashed, that means he cut the corner early. He didn't go out as far west as you're supposed to and turn and come in and land like you're supposed to. He cut it close. He got a downdraft of some kind, and his wing hit a light pole, and then he cartwheeled and almost ran into the apartments there. And, he burned it, died on impact. So I said, it's a terrible tragedy, and this is indicative of the attitude of the people that fly, is that they take risks, and they put us at risk. And but I didn't want to take advantage of his tragedy, so I made sure I was very respectful about the whole thing. But that's what happened, and that happens at all the airports all the time. The pilots cut the corners, come in hard. And, so I had finally gotten in contact with John Kinney, who was now the airport manager. An old pro, been to many airports, Long Beach, Aspen, a few different places. And he's a good guy. And so I get invited to the community work group, which is spring of 2023. And I had a separate meeting up there that maybe we can talk about, but that was before that. But so I go to the community work group, which is sponsored by the city. So I go to the first meeting, and here are all these fancy multicolored charts on the wall with these kind of fat cute airplanes with smiles on them. And I'm like, all right, this is a snow job. This is a snow job. If the city paid for this, they must have hired a consultant that is pro-airport, because look at all this. Here's a timeline on the wall, on the whatever we were met at the building that's over there at Old Pearl, like 49th. There's a community building over there. So we met there.
I think I was there.
Yeah, for the first one.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I didn't know you yet. And so there's the timeline showing, airport was built, first flight, and first time, I don't know, the people did a
black and white photos, making you feel
and all this nostalgic stuff. The first glider flight, and the first flight for the University of Colorado. All these milestones.
There's a soldier hugging his mom in front of the Black Hawk helicopter. That sort of thing.
They didn't say anything about fighting fires or rescuing anybody, but that was to come later. But and that's where I'm meeting all the people there, and there's. So, the airport serves about 0.01% of the population of Boulder, and yet 50% of the people at this meeting were pro or airport related, and 50% were just, regular people from the community. And that's where I met Lisa Morzell and Jill Grano, and is it Grano? Grano. And Laura Kaplan was there. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm at we're having these little breakout sessions, and I'm at the table, and there's a bunch of pilots there. And
I'll just point out that those three people were all signatories on the petition for the airport neighborhood campaign.
Okay, that's right. Yeah. So anyway, this is before that happened. So I'm sitting there, and so there's a guy at the end of the table. And he says, I'm living in some apartments to the west of the airport. And, I'm worried about my daughter because you guys are, I accept the noise and stuff, but, you guys are putting lead on us from the fuel. And I'm kind of shocked. I'm like, what do you mean lead?
They're
burning leaded fuel? So I didn't know they were burning leaded fuel.
Yeah.
And so
I don't either. I learned about this in the last few years. It's amazing to me that's even possible. Yeah.
And once you get into it, you can see why they still are. And so the guy says, I'm worried about my daughter. She's out on her hands and knees, and she's eating dirt and stuff like that. So a guy at the other end of the table, a pilot, and he says, and I'm quoting, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that, because the only way that can get into your system is if you get it on the end of your finger and you stick it into your body cavity." That's a quote. And I just looked at the guy, and I'm just like, okay, there's something going on here, and it's very crooked.
That sounds like an explanation you want to believe if it's convenient for you.
Yeah, so you can only get lead if you put it on your finger and stick it through your body cavity. And everybody kind of looked at him, and the person that was from Kimley Horn, that was the company that they hired to put on the C Community Work Group, which does master plans for airports. That's one of their jobs that they get paid for. So I don't know why the city couldn't just put on their own work group, but I guess they needed a Kimley Horn to make this timeline and then get these kind of little pictures of the airplanes that were fat and had smiles on them. They kind of look like the Chevron avatars for cars. They're fat and they're kind of cute, and children like them.
Adorable.
Yeah, and so in terms of solidarity, this is my first example of solidarity. Is half the people there are like concerned about the aviation, and it's pretty remarkable. And just for that one day, I was kind of sick of the comments that people were making. One guy stood up to say something about. It turned out it was a guy named Andrew McKenna. I didn't know it at the time, but he got up and said, "Well, lead's not a problem. It's from the lead mines and from leftover from when cars burned leaded fuel. More than 30 years ago. They're still worried about that, and so it was everybody just kind of."
I actually don't follow the reasoning of that or why it's faulty. I mean, it sounds filthy, but can you explain it to me? Like,
I mean, so yeah, the lead on the ground from the cars is so blown away or so buried into the soil that it's not getting whipped up. And the lead from lead mines, the particles are enormous, right? And so they're not in the air.
yeah,
And as you find out when you get into this, is that the main way to get lead from the airplanes is respiration,
yeah.
breathing.
Well, I mean, more generally, how do you get lead into your body? Period.
Lead in your body, so you can get it from the water.
Yeah,
You can get it through your mouth by eating it, or you can breathe it.
yeah.
Now, usually,
It helps if they're like
That's right.
nanoparticles, right?
So,
Like, to breathe.
and it turns out that, that's why lead paint is an issue. They don't want kids pulling themselves up to a windowsill and gnawing on the windowsill because they can get lead that way. Like if they go and sandblast an old bridge, it'll probably have lead paint on it. And that will, all those particles, because they're huge particles, will blow onto the properties that are nearby, and then you can get it from, let's say you're growing vegetables or your kids are playing out there and they'll get on their hands and, they can breathe it in, but they can also ingest it. But for airplanes, the particles that you get from combustion have a medium size of about 13 nanometers. And
That's pretty small.
Pretty small. The smallest particle that the fiberglass filters that they use to do air particle monitoring is 2 microns. So 2 microns. So a micron is a millionth of a meter.
All right, that sounds really small. If I breathe in a nanoparticle of lead, do I have to worry about it?
Yes.
Why?
Because it goes it goes right through the lining of your lungs.
Yeah.
It gets into your blood, and now it's these microparticles, and you have the same problems with other types of microparticles. They can clog up your capillaries, but lead has a special property, is that it's in the same column of the element table as calcium, and so it can exchange with calcium in your blood and in your bones, and that's where it starts to deposit, and it can also deposit in your fat, and so
It collects.
Yeah, it collects, and so I grew up in the lead age, and I'm probably, when I was growing up, I probably had lead 5 to 10 micrograms per deciliter when I was growing up here in Boulder.
It was everywhere. It
was everywhere. But
if there's any younger listeners, like all of our cars burn leaded fuel.
but your blood lead level will go down if you're not exposed to it, because it will reach like homeostasis with your bones, and it'll get deposited out into your bones, and so then it's there, and so this leads to problems later on in life. Say for elderly women who start to lose calcium as their bones start to get weaker, they start to give up calcium. I forget the term for it. Osteogenesis or osteoporosis. So that's an example where a lot of the times the lead will get released from their bones, ancient lead that's been in them for a long time. So that's what's wrong with that statement. And the other statement that same person made when he wrote or he responded to a reporter in the camera was, well, I'm around leaded fuel all the time, and I don't have any in my body. I don't know if that's true or not, but he made that statement. Whether he has it in his blood, I don't know. But you wouldn't get it in your body if it's in a liquid state. The molecule is too big to go through your lung wall because it hasn't been combusted yet. Tetraethyl lead is got 4 ethyls on a lead atom. It's a huge molecule. It's not going to go through your skin, and it has a very low vapor pressure, so it's not going to be in the atmosphere, so that you can breathe it in.
Like if you smelled leaded fuel, that doesn't put you in danger.
No, it'll smell just like gasoline.
Yeah.
You're smelling the butanes and the pentanes that are in the gasoline. That's what comes out. That's what gives it vapor pressure.
Yeah. So if you want to distribute lead to a city, so that people are breathing it in, you've got to put it in the air and then burn it distribute it that way. Right?
Yeah, and an efficient way to do that would to put it into airplanes and have them do circles over your city.
Yeah, over your
that
city.
way you could make sure that
and it's to the tune of a couple 100 pounds of lead. I mean, that's a lot of nanoparticles. Yeah.
So each gallon has 2.5 grams of lead in it.
And so you add that up with all the gallons of fuel burned
and
over
so
the city, and it's
when they're taking off,
hundreds of pounds. I think.
Yeah. So Boulder has about 500 pounds a year.
Okay.
RMMA is like maybe 2,000 pounds a year.
Ouch.
And that area over there is saturated with lead, and it's a problem.
It's very disappointing to me. I wish that it wasn't, because I've now worked there 15 years.
Yeah, it gets better
at the end of that airport.
Yeah. So it's hard to say if you were to get your blood tested if you would have it or not. It kind of depends on the wind patterns.
Yeah.
And it drops off sharply as you move away from the airport. And this is where the Reed-Hillview study comes in. So in 2011, Santa Clara County out in San Jose got money to study the lead distribution from Reed-Hillview Airport. And it wasn't because they had a complaint from the citizens. They were doing it just to check on it. And so they understood that you couldn't sample it by sampling the air with the fiberglass filters, and doing soil testing wasn't representative because it disperses when it gets into the soil. It either gets incorporated into the plants,
nanoparticles,
or it goes down. Well, they're not nanoparticles, and they bounce around and they get accumulated. And unfortunately, this study took from 2011, and the results were presented in August of 2021. And unfortunately, what they found is that the best receptor for testing the amount of lead in the air was children's blood levels. Turns out them breathing is the most efficient way for extracting lead out of the atmosphere and measuring it. They didn't want that, but that's why they didn't even bother with looking at the environmental testing companies who use the fiberglass filters to test for
Can
lead.
you give us some sense of the scale of that study and the statistical power that might have been?
So they had about 17,000 children that they tracked, and they were measuring their blood lead levels. I think either weekly or monthly. I can't remember what it was, but it was a massive study. They got the guys from Mountain Data out of Fort Collins, who's a very respected data analysis company. Sammy Zaran is a prof at CU. He's an economist, but he's also a data scientist. And they had top-rate statisticians working on it, and so they've got this cadre of children that they're measuring, and they track them. Each one is there for 4 to 5, 6, whatever years, and they're tracking their levels, and they're tracking their position around the airport along with the wind. And so they, using that data, they're able to come up with a model. And they made it a linear model so that, it would maybe not as accurate, but the tendencies and the trends would be accurate. And so they had very high probability and high confidence in the lead distribution around the airport.
And then so you can show which children have higher levels of lead, and does that correlate to any kind of health outcomes or behavioral outcomes in the study? Yeah. Did they study that in that one?
No, not particularly in that test, but that's been studied.
We kind of know.
Places.
We've known that for
so
literally thousands,
behavioral,
hundreds of years.
Intelligence, reading comprehension. There's a whole slew of tests, and if you look at a bell curve of intelligence, like say 5 micrograms per deciliter shifts the bell curve towards the left if intelligence is on the X scale.
This pisses me off. This really upsets me because in a simple model, when you think about exposure or harms or whatever, you think have I been exposed to lead? Maybe yes, maybe no. Was I affected by it? Probably not. Move on, right? But if you think about that whole bell curve, that bell curve's not like a few people. That's the population. And you imagine shifting the whole bell curve over 5 IQ points or 10 IQ points. That means, like, I'm a pretty smart guy, but I would honestly, I'd like those 5 or 10 IQ points back from the time I spent in the 70s and 80s.
So, yeah, and that's it's tragic, because what matters are the tails, and not so much the tail on the right,
sure,
the high intelligence, but the tail on the left, because that small shift means now that you're subjecting
whoever's in that tail.
Depending on the size of the population, but like in the United States, when they were looking at this stuff, is you're subjecting another 300,000-400,000 children to a significant change in their IQ, and has all kinds of lifelong effects.
And I just want to point out that we're doing this right now in Boulder. There's communities right adjacent to the airport where Boulder's actively talking about building more housing near the airport. And so, I think it's really unjust and criminal. Not criminal, but it's lame. It's effing lame that we're polluting kids' lungs with lead.
Yeah, and the sad part is that it's been known for a long time, and Marie Lynn Miranda did the seminal study in 2011 when she looked at a cluster of airports in North Carolina, and it shows the kids in that part of the state have elevated blood lead levels. And you remember how crazy people went when Flint, Michigan switched their water, from the Detroit River to the Flint River, and it was more caustic because it's a more polluted river. And they basically increased the BLL, the blood lead level of those children. The average was like 0.4. It went up to 0.8 micrograms per deciliter. And that was a national catastrophe. I mean, they're bringing in bottled water. There was they didn't really do much about it, but they, they did it to save a few dollars in terms of the cost of the water, and they quit using a passivating chemical that coats the inside of the pipes, and so that's what we're doing right now. And at Reed-Hillview, the kids on the east side of the airport, which is downwind, those kids are 4 to 10 micrograms per deciliter. So well within the range that is going to cause significant lifelong learning disabilities and other health effects.
Yeah.
And so let's just finish up with that study, because the results of that study were presented at a press conference in August of 2021. And, Bruce Lanphier was one of the co-authors, Sammy Zoran, Cindy Chavez, who was a supervisor there, and then they had somebody else, a couple other people, but they did a presentation on a Zoom meeting to hundreds of people, and boom, it just rocked everybody, because now all the people, and it's mainly a Hispanic community and poor that lives around the airport there, they're like, we've been being saturated for decades. And this airport has grown and grown with their number of flights, because when it started out in the 40s, it was a little ag airport for crop dusters. But then it became a general aviation, and the flights kept piling on. And so it's a little bit busier than Boulder.
Yeah.
And that's the effect there. And so to their credit, the supervisors there, and with pressure from the community, and I got in touch with Veronica Licon. She had a son that went in and he was having some problems. You know, he was having some weird pains in his neck and his joints. And she went to the doctor, and they're doing all these tests, and they can't find anything. And finally, the guy measures the blood level. He was at like 5 or 6 micrograms per deciliter. And she had a couple other kids living there, and she's living in her parents' house. You know, she's working as an attorney, you know, taking care of her family, and you know, she said, I asked her when I interviewed her, we have a bunch of interviews on Zoom, I said, well, why didn't you get your daughter measured? Because she's younger. And she said, well, I couldn't bring myself to do it because I felt so bad and guilty that I'd poisoned my son by living here. But I didn't know about it, and now I put my daughter at risk.
Yeah.
And her daughter has behavioral issues. You know, but she never got it, you know, measured because she didn't want to know. And, you know, her daughter's like, seems almost like she's autistic, you know, sort of in the range of autism. And it was freaking tragic to listen to her. You know, it's kind of to just show you, you know, how people are about this. There was a guy on the call when I was interviewing her. So he's texting me messaging me, just to me, because I'm the manager of the call. He says, yeah, I think we've heard enough from her. I mean, I don't see what good this is doing. You know, and I just let her go because, you know, she started crying a few times, and I thought it was kind of heartless for this guy to want to cut her off. You know, she's telling her story. And, but to get back to the study was a bombshell, August of 21. And then October of 21, the supervisor said, we're banning sale of leaded fuel at Reed-Hillview Airport. And the pilot community and the FAA went berserk. And they're threatening all these lawsuits, and they over and over. And Cindy and the other 3 supervisors said, you know, we are going to put the health of our community ahead of the very, very narrow needs of the general aviation and the flight schools that are here.
Yeah, I remember reading something in the Boulder reporting lab about how complicated it was going to be to provide unleaded fuel here. And I just thought, my first reaction is like an extra tank, a little more, another delivery truck. Like, how complicated is it? And couldn't we do this overnight if we had the political will and to do it?
So there you had the supervisors that weren't going to take it. They said, we're going to put the health ahead. And so since then, they had some kind of reauthorization act in 2024. And it specifically said, all right, no more airports can ban leaded fuel. Otherwise, you get a $5,000 a day fine. I don't know. I mean, if I was a county commissioner, I'd say, fine, let's take the $5,000 a day. And, you know what, we'll take it out of the airport budget or something like that. But, you know, but what people need to remember, and which never comes up, is that everything that's good, or that you can say that's good about aviation, could be done with airplanes that don't burn leaded fuel, don't fly off course, and don't make a lot of noise. They have them over in Europe. All the airplanes over in Europe, they don't have an FAA over there, like in Belgium or Switzerland or Germany. They have strict rules when they can fly. They have strict noise limitations, like the ESA limit is like 72 decibels at the end of the runway at 30 meters.
Yeah.
So they monitor it, and they can achieve that. And the Swiss companies over there and the German companies came up with high performance mufflers for the exhausts. Yes, you had to put a little cowling indentation in the bottom of the plane's body, or you didn't have to, depending how slow it was. It didn't have aerodynamic effect. But anything that you do with an airplane, you could do it with an airplane that stays on course, doesn't burn leaded fuel, and it isn't loud. This is not a requirement. They don't have to be that way. But you would think that even the slightest request to get them to change the pilot community, that just raises a hysterical response. And then the reason it is what it is because they have powerful friends on city council and civic leaders.
I have good news for you. The pro airport people, a year and a half ago said that they were phasing out leaded fuel. It'd be gone in 5 years. So that means we only have 3.5 years left of leaded fuel.
That's a big maybe. It's 100%. Thanks for that softball. That was a huge maybe because they've had that mandate probably 6 times. So there's a good article by Ariel Wickenberg. She's the one who wrote the article about Miss Lacone and the effects of the Reed-Hillview on the community around there. And there's a follow-up article looking at the history of every time that the FAA and the industry has blown through their mandates to get rid of leaded fuel. There's probably 6 or 8 times that this has happened. And first of all, it's not a mandate. So right now the current thing is called the EAGLE program. I don't forget what it stands for, but it's it's on the FAA webpage. You go there and it says, and this is the operating sentence for the whole EAGLE program, says the FAA would like there to be unleaded fuel by 2030 if a safe and commercially available substitute can be found. All right?
Sounds great.
Right. If.
Yeah.
But it's interesting how the airport supporters will then use that in their op-eds in the Boulder Daily Camera to say, yep,
don't worry about it.
There's a mandate
going away.
And it'll be gone by 2030. There's no mandate there.
Yeah.
There's no rule. There's no thing. And there's another, there was one that Adrian and I wrote in the camera. And he said that the EPA has banned leaded fuel by 2030. So that's in his op-ed. But the EPA has no jurisdiction. Yes, they've labeled lead from airplanes as an endangerment, an official endangerment. They probably wouldn't do it now, but back then they labeled it as an endangerment to public health. And they stated there is no safe level of lead. But here we have, these civic leaders. The person, Jan Burton, in her op-ed, she's the one who said it's the EPA has mandated it. And
don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it. There's no point. It's going to be gone by 2030, so don't fight it.
Yeah,
but that's, that's not 3 years away. That's 5 years away. That's a whole nother generation of children at San Lazaro and Monte Vista.
Yeah, you're born today.
Yeah,
in 3.5, 5 years from now, you've absorbed all the worst effects.
The lung volume to blood ratio is much higher for children.
Yeah,
and so it has a much higher effect. The particulate lead from the airplanes on their blood lead levels, and it's going to be registered much higher. And the modeling tells us that they're at risk at San Lazaro and Monte Vista. The kids living over here in Rock, whatever it is, right up here just to the north of the airport, that neighborhood there. The people on,
Do you feel comfortable talking about your lead exposure?
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of years ago, I was at work where they have analytical equipment, and I gave them a drop of my blood to measure it. So it wasn't an official test.
Okay.
But they have part per billion measuring lead, and my blood didn't have any lead in it.
This is 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
But you were
4 years ago.
Oh, before you moved.
No, this is when I found out. So this is when in 23, when I found out they were burning leaded fuel at the airport.
Yeah.
So they put it through the ICP mass spec, so inductively coupled plasma. So it has a 7,000 degree centigrade plasma that disintegrates all the molecules into their atoms, and then every atom then goes into the mass spec. And since they all have a different mass, they show up, and that's how you can have a very high resolution. I mean, the detection level is like 1/10 of a part per billion.
Wow.
So I didn't have lead in my blood.
Yay.
So I'm back here end of October of 2025. I'm back here full time.
Because you've been commuting.
Because I've been commuting in the Bay Area for the last 20 years. Or since 2020, back and forth, and was living out there. So I get my blood tested in November, and I'm at 1.6.
Up from 0.
I went to 1.6 micrograms per deciliter. And it's been hanging out here for 2.5 months.
Yeah.
And no doubt that the children around the airport are going to be at least that level. Because
do you feel like you're losing your edge? Are you not as smart as you used to be?
Well, this can happen. Yeah. I feel like my analytical powers are higher, but I can't always remember the correct word to use. So,
but I get the reason I asked that facetious question is because we often associate lead exposure with developmental delays and intelligence as for growing children, but there's all kinds of negative stuff going on with lead for grown adults that we should be concerned about.
So the other main thing to look at, and this is what Bruce Lanphier published about 1.5 years ago. There was I don't know if he published it, but he brought it to my attention. I think he was a co-author on it, but they did a huge study on the effects of lead on heart disease, specifically effects on the arteries, coronary arteries. And there is a very close correlation to the drop in lead over time. When they banned, or then it was finally phased out in '92, and then there's a few other times when it came back, and you can see these blips in the coronary heart disease, specifically arterial disease, follows that exactly.
Wow.
And they did a subsequent study looking at the data in Britain, where they went off lead and went back on it. So they had a designed experiment, and the heart disease follows that exactly. And so when they do look at postmortems, and they bring this up in the article in the paper, and it's a peer-reviewed paper, looking at the lesions inside of the arteries, they do have lead particles in them. And what happens is it causes a little injury on the side of the arterial wall, and then that becomes a place for stuff to start to stick and to try to repair itself in cholesterol, and that's part of the process of trying to repair the inside of the arterial wall. So lead is very much not just for development in children, but for us, for me.
So you've made your point. So assuming that's true, you would think that when lead was at its peak in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the automobiles, there would have been a strong correlation with heart disease.
There is.
True or false?
100%. There is a true fault. There is a strong correlation, among other things.
Totally. Yeah.
But that's the strong correlation, in which basically, a correlation is not a theory. You need a theory, but the empiricism is, the p-value, which is the probability that it occurred by chance, is less than 0.01%.
Yeah.
So when you see the drop in lead in the atmosphere because they're getting rid of leaded fuel in automobiles, you see a sharp drop, and the heart disease drops right with it. And this is, you're controlling for diet, socioeconomic, exposure to other chemicals. All that is in the paper. They're controlled for those things because the study population is huge. You've got hundreds and hundreds of thousands of points to get the statistics on it. So,
we've been going for about an hour. I haven't looked at the clock. This is interesting to me. I'm not sure if it's interesting to all listeners.
Well, let's maybe if we could wrap up with just what's going on with the city and the county.
Yeah.
And let me just start with.
I mean, we can make this a 2-hour episode too, if you want. We
can break it up into two because, and maybe because I have this weird quality in my voice that tends to put people to sleep. But when this stuff with the lead comes out, that's when I said, all right, I'm going to start to try to organize. I had a meeting down here at Valmont Church. That's where I met Laura. Nicole Spear was there. Tara Weiner was there. And then a bunch of neighbors. We had about 15 or 20 people showed up, and so I'm like, all right, what are we going to do? We've got these airplanes, and there is no control over how they treat the people on the ground. I know this from my interaction with the FAA. So we need...
Well, your interaction with all the other people you've met along the way and their interactions with the FAA is...
That's right.
It's not like it's just you.
That's right. Across the country, Santa Monica, Torrance, Bend, Oregon, Reed-Hillview, everywhere. The FAA, East Hampton...
Yeah, well, for me, I was thinking more along the lines of Boulder County. I mean, there's
Vance Brand, RMMA, Erie.
There's a lot of people.
There is no intervention by the FAA to look out for the people on the ground.
Yeah.
And everybody finds this out. As soon as you go into this and you try to file a complaint or do anything with the FAA, the answer they come back with, it doesn't affect flight safety. And that's the end of it.
Yeah.
And the cities and the counties that take money from the FAA, they're bound to not infringe on the pilot's rights to fly however they think is best.
This reminds me of something. I probably shouldn't speak on Jill Grano's behalf, but a story that she told about working for Congressman Joe Neguse is that she thought she was going to go work on congressional stuff, federal level stuff. This was going to be a big opportunity, and she just was so discouraged by how much time was spent by all the complaints that the office received related to airport noise and leaded fuel. And so I say that as a way of saying, like, the FAA is not taking it up, so our congressional offices get a lot of calls because no one else is listening.
So that's an interesting point, because the FAA has made itself the arbiter to take care of any of these complaints, and by giving the cities and the counties money, they restrict them from enforcing any of the grant assurances. They call them Part 16 and Part 12, whatever, all these different parts of the grant assurances. I mean, Bree Lehman is the expert on this. And but so what it comes out of it is that the aviation community would have you think that your city or your county has lost all sovereignty to control the airport. Because anytime you do anything, they use these grant assurances as a way to threaten the city with a lawsuit.
You took this money, and now you have to obey the things that we...
And so what they do is there's different classes of airplane, like Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. And all these rules that say you can't inhibit us, you can't charge landing fees, anything that might inhibit interstate commerce, those are for the bigger airplanes. The ones that are turboprops that burn kerosene, not burning leaded piston engine airplane fuel. All these rules apply to that. And so there's this whole thing of rules that they use to threaten the cities with. And it's not true. And these cities have a lot of latitude, and they can do things. And this is what Reed-Hillview showed us. The county there said, no, we're going to take it. Go ahead and sue us. We'll go to court on this, and we'll establish a precedent. And that is the last thing the FAA wants to do. And this is the lesson that we learned from Santa Monica, because they're closing the airport for all these same reasons that we've been talking about. For there, it was mainly noise, but then the lead became an issue. And they waited till the grant assurances ran out. They didn't re-up the money, and now they're shutting the airport in 2029. And the FAA fought it to the very last second. And they even paid about $600,000 to get a ballot initiative to try to give control of the airport to the FAA in perpetuity. And that lost 70-30. And
I just thought of something. What we need is a countdown clock on the on the website where you go and it says 14 years, 7 months, 12 days, whatever it is.
no,
On Boulder's effort here.
it's too long, and the effects of the lead and the noise are too onerous. The city and the county can and should use their governmental power to push back.
Yeah.
And not allow public harm. And they should just take them on, and they could do that. And so, just to kind of get it in perspective, the arguments to protect the airport basically have two characters. One, we're gonna get rid of the leaded fuel, so don't bother.
Don't worry about it.
Two is the FAA controls it, and the FAA is all powerful, so don't even think about trying to go up against the FAA.
Yeah.
And the two main proponents of that point of view are Matt Benjamin on the city council now, and former mayor Bob Yates. And this is Yates wrote something in his. He's got a monthly newsletter. I don't know how often it comes out. It came out in August of 24, and he wrote. I'm quoting. Santa Monica got permission from the FAA to close its airport because of the safety and hazards having all the airplanes there, because they're just up the road is LAX, there's Hawthorne, and these other airports, and that's why the FAA is allowing Santa Monica to close. All right, so I read that. I didn't send Bob an email or a request, so I called John Fairweather, the lead activist at Santa Monica, and I sent him, the quote, and I said, John, can you comment on this? And he said, this is 100% false. There is no evidence for this, and furthermore, the FAA never takes care of congestion by closing the airport. They just reroute the airplanes, but they have never once closed an airport because of congestion. The FAA fought this up to the last minute because it was getting ready to go to trial in the county where Santa Monica is located, and they did not want to lose a case. And so they said, all right, you can shut down your airport.
But only you. And there's no legal precedent.
I'm serious. Right? Not only you, they just said Santa Monica.
That's what I mean.
You can shut down your airport.
Yeah.
So I sent Bob Yates an email. I said, I haven't seen this, any evidence for this. Can you give me your sources for this? So he wrote back and said, you can look that up on your own just as easy as I did and find out for yourself. These are all from public documents. And so I wrote it back and I said, Mr. Yates, I talked to the attorney out there and the lead activist, and I did a search. I can't find any articles where the FAA gave permission to shut it down. So will you please give me your references or print a retraction? And then he went quiet on the issue.
Yeah.
And so that's the issue of don't go against the FAA. You can't win. And so here's a strong civic leader, a lot of influence, former mayor. He's telling people don't fight the FAA. You can't win. And his compadre in this is Matt Benjamin. He did something about the ANC a couple years ago, making an absurd statement. But let's just focus on his recent statement when the court ruled on the Boulder's lawsuit against the FAA to get permission to shut down the airport. So the ruling came out, and a gentleman from the 4 Mile housing development, which is to the west of here, and in the path of the airplanes when they head into the wind on a west wind day, he wrote back, let's just shut the airport down because it's a hazard, it's giving lead, it's bugging people, and the land could be used for could make so much more money for the city of Boulder, and would be a boon to the city of Boulder. So Matt Benjamin writes back, and the operative sentence says, well, the court ruled that the city cannot shut the airport down. Only FAA can shut it down. And so when you go and look at the ruling, as you could read in the Boulder Reporting Lab, which he surely must have been able to read, it says the judge ruled on it on a very narrow basis, saying that it was not time for this lawsuit, and it was, and I'm not saying that it's right or wrong, but this is not the time because there's been no injury to Boulder, so you don't have grounds for a lawsuit.
Yeah, with respect to the question at hand, it didn't say that Boulder hasn't been injured. Carte blanche. It just meant, with respect to the specific question, which was, does the city have to do it in perpetuity?
It does not say the city does not have the authority to should. So you have to ask the question. I'm sure Matt Benjamin. I don't know if he's a scientist or what he is, or he probably went to college.
He has some science background for sure.
He probably went to college. He can read. He knows English. How could you come up with that interpretation? And it's just part of the general attitude that people would support the airport. It's anything goes to preserve it and to preserve our entitlement and our privilege. And part of that is the right to dive bomb people if they speak out of it, criticizing it. And so they refer to people that talk about the airport as complainers. And they also use the word Karens, like as if there's kind of elite people out here who don't want to be, them complaining about the airport, makes them a Karen. Of course, a Karen is someone who fights against civil rights because, they don't want a racial minority walking on their sidewalk or something like that. Or, that's where that term came from. But so they're using that to try to diminish the actual specifics of the arguments, and the main argument is that the airport doesn't confer rights to anybody. Only people have rights. The fact that the airport was here in 1928 does not confer rights to keep flying off course, too low, and burning leaded fuel. Yeah. But that's what is used. And I said, all right, let's turn that around. My house was built in 1883. Therefore, I have supersede the rights of you, because my house gives me rights based on its age. And they just look at you and they're like, I can't understand what you're saying. And, you made the decision to live there. And I said, well, based on your argument, you shouldn't be flying at an airport that has you flying over an existing neighborhood.
Yeah,
that's the correct argument using that logic. But
I think the much more powerful argument is that being first doesn't give you the right to be a shitty neighbor.
Yeah, could you imagine?
You just think back of the silver miners were here before before the airport was. Should we just live with all the mercury and whatever else they're dumping into the creek? Mm-hmm. And by the way, the silver miners weren't here first,
Yeah.
And so I just feel like we ought to have a mindset of being neighborly and having reasonable rules and following them.
And that's like I said before, you don't have to have an airplane that burns leaded fuel, is loud, and flies off course. We could be as civilized as Europe if we wanted to.
Yeah.
But to get to where government is, so, I think it was in October of 24, I called up Aaron Brockett. So he's the mayor. So I left a message. He called me back. And I said, look, this is ridiculous. We got the airplanes are flying off course and they're burning leaded fuel. They're poisoning the community. It's not nothing, even though Jan Burton's op-ed said that tests show that there's nothing in the soil, that doesn't mean anything, and they know that because the Reed-Hillview studies out there.
Place to look.
Yeah, the Reed-Hillview study out there. There's the particle size study is out there. These are peer-reviewed studies. And I said, so don't you think the city should do something about it? And he said, yep, I agree. It's bad, but we have to do what's feasible. And that tells you exactly what the issue is.
It's politically
feasible.
Feasible
Feasible means who's going to cost us the most money. And right now, the general aviation community, apparently, in my opinion, they represent the biggest threat because they're talking lawsuit.
Yeah.
But that also tells us what we need to do is to correct the situation, is we need to organize and then look at the legal realm, because, you know, the two centers of decision making, the city council and the staff, those are the two areas where decisions are made. Neither one of them is going to just lay over or going to do the right thing and take care of the people out around the airports in terms of the lead poisoning or the noise. They're not going to do it. So there is no parliamentary path to take care of this problem.
Well, I will say, which you dismissed a bit ago, there is something positive going on at the city that should give us. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how to think about it, but we haven't taken binding grants from the feds for almost 6 years, and that takes a lot of political will, and there's some risk involved with that, real risk from the city manager and from other folks. I mean, I know it's not what you want, because that means, like, if we stay on that timeline, that means we're getting to the starting point 14 years from now in terms of thinking about shutting down the airport. But I do want to say that it would be very easy, politically expedient, I think, for the city manager to start taking federal funds again, that are binding out past the 20 years. So at least, I mean, there is that one very strong thing of support, even if it's not on the path, the shortest path that you're hoping for.
That's right.
That we're hoping for. I don't mean to point at you. But.
And that's correct. And the problem that I run into is that every time there's some type of step forward, it's always a compromise, and it always allows for the burning of leaded fuel and no change in the equipment up there.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when Ashley Stoltzman and Kevin, right? Anyway, what's the other state representative for Erie? What's his name? I forget his name. But anyway, when we had Bruce Lanphier come to town to speak at the E-Town, like 80 people showed up, and so they presented the HB 1235, which is all airports have to offer unleaded fuel by 2030. So offering unleaded fuel doesn't mean they're going to get rid of unleaded fuel, and even the smallest cost is enough to continue the use of the leaded fuel. And there's also the belief that it somehow lubricates the valve stems in these engines, because they want it. And these guys, and there was a letter in the Boulder Weekly about 3 years ago. A guy wrote, I just bought my 1967 Piper Cub, and the county is thinking of getting rid of leaded fuel. How am I going to fly my airplane? Don't they know that I need to get the upper cylinder head lubrication from the lead? And this is probably a guy probably in his 30s, and he went out and bought his airplane. And, the concept of the right to fly is so entrenched. And also there's kind of an idolatry that goes with the flying, like up and away to the wild blue yonder. And it's, this kind of myth. But it's,
There's a lot of people moving through life who think their exhaust don't stink.
Yeah, and they also don't think it's heavier than air.
Yeah.
And
well, so what I want to say is, when we haven't talked about the airport neighborhood campaign. There's like 100 things we haven't talked about. But when I was collecting signatures for those ballot measures, I was collecting at the same time as these chirpy young Gen Z folks were collecting signatures for a ballot measure for a constitutional amendment for reproductive rights. And so all they had to do was they would just say abortion, and people just knew people generally speaking know how they feel about abortion and whether they're willing to sign a petition to guarantee reproductive rights. And people would just either be like, no thanks, or yeah, I'll sign that. And they said about a dozen words to get one signature. And I'm sitting there, nobody knows. Half the people I talk to don't even know there's an airport in our city. They don't understand why we might want to close it, what's involved. What's the FAA? Is that the food and what? Food and no, that's the FDA. And so I have to give a 300 to 500 word speech for every signature, and that's glossing over a ton of details. And the sad thing is that we've gone 84 minutes so far. And I have a whole laundry list of things we haven't talked about yet. That's because there's we could just itemize real quick, kind of like the landscape. There's the economic injustice of using this space up here that's city owned, that generates so little revenue that they run negative. The economic impact of this airport is so ridiculously small, and and we could talk about what they claim the economic impact is, and there's actually some hilarious stories involved in that narrative. Thank you, Bree, for that. There's economic injustice. There's the leaded pollution, toxic chemicals. We've covered that pretty well today. What else did I want to say? There's just the whole airport neighborhood campaign, which we didn't really talk about. We're losing our video, but that's okay.
So I think one thing that's worth talking about is just it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy in that it wasn't publicized, but the guy Paul Anslow, the airport manager down at RMMA, like in 2012 or 2014. They decided, all right, we are going to expand our operations way beyond what our aviation lease allows us, because everybody had started to figure out you could start running each one of your Cessnas. You could start running 10 flight instructors a day and start making money on these old planes, because all we can do is we can start loaning out money for flight school and start bringing in all kinds of pilots. And they started to ramp up the flights, and they brought in maybe 5 or 6 more flight schools, and they started flying there. And then they started figuring out, well, we're crowded here, so let's start doing touch and goes at Boulder, Longmont, and Erie. And the
traffic just went.
And so you can see the expansion of the traffic here, and that's also when the complaints start, because people kind of took it, up until about 2014. And my neighbor up the road, he's like, we moved in here in 2012, and it wasn't too bad. But then 2014, it just, and the expansion of the gliders, those have increased.
Well, so this reminds me of something. Is when you go to a pro airport event and you hear the case that they make for why the airport is great and all the values that it provides, all the value that it provides. We could spend a whole podcast dismantling all the arguments that they make. I'm trying to think. The one I was thinking of just left me. Sorry. Well, one of them is the flight schools and all the opportunities you're giving to young people to do that. Oh, the other one is, of course, emergency services and firefighting. And, these just don't hold up to any kind of scrutiny at all. Anyways.
Yeah, there was one tanker flight out of here with 250 pounds of retardant, like in the 1990s. Everything comes out of RMMA or Centennial.
Yep.
The big, heavy tankers that actually matter. 2013, there might have been some flights out of here, but it was mainly helicopter.
Yeah.
And helicopters really can land anywhere. And the science part of it. Yep, there's some companies that work for looking at fracking. They want to map. They do mapping because they have a calibrated points around here, and they like to fly over there. But the whole issue of since when does an entity like a city or a county give up the right to say anything about its airport or its piece of land? I mean, it's owned by the citizens. And this is where the electeds and the staff could step up and test it. But, like I said, it's across the country, it's like this. And, it's probably going to take a more organized effort because, just watching this, I don't see that there's really a parliamentary path to making any type of change at the airport. It's going to have to be, landing fees and then legal action from the community, not against the city because they're immune, but against the people that fly there. And that's really the way it's going to have to move. And, people like, the council members that are pro-airport, at some point, their friends are going to come into the crosshairs of the community, but it's hard to do. Because like you said, I've got a stack of flyers in Spanish that I need to get over to San Lazaro. I've been looking for someone who speaks Spanish to help me. And, so that's going to be part of the organizing effort.
So that makes me think of two things. One is another thing we didn't really talk about was the federal lawsuit that the city filed and what that meant. And I mean, we kind of summarized the punchline, which is that it was dismissed and they said come back in 14 years, basically.
Right.
Implied if you're on our side of this issue. I guess the question I want to ask is how should people get involved? Where should they go to learn more information? What do you need?
Yeah, I mean, so there's lots of local groups. So there's Save Our Skies. If you do a quick search, that's Bree Lehman set that up. So Save Our Skies is a local group. There's Airport Neighborhood Campaign. It's more focused on the housing. And the reason I got into that is because, that was a group that said, all right, we want to do something about the airport.
Yeah, let people vote.
But I think, the housing issue is they're going to wait till, the grant assurances run out. And I just don't think that's good for the people that live from the, the heart disease angle and for the child development angle.
Totally.
We should not be waiting that long.
No.
Ro Khanna put it best a couple of years ago when he was talking about Reed-Hillview, because he's a congressman from Santa Clara. And he said, we cannot look at the special interests of the aviation community for in this case it says for 6 more years. I mean, that's another generation of children that are going to be poisoned. And it's just not right, and we shouldn't do it. And, I think that's where we need to move to. So Airspace for All is where you can get involved with. And then there's Quiet Skies, which has a bunch of local groups around here.
And then if you know Spanish and you want to help pass out some flyers. I've actually...
working on your Spanish?
No, but I've dropped off literature in those neighborhoods before. And, I mean, I think it would be great to have Spanish speakers in our coalition to help with the communication. But in terms of just dropping off flyers, we could do that.
That's right. And I did drop off, like when we had our lead meeting with Robert Boutel at the church. I dropped off maybe 250 flyers there, inviting people to come to not a single person showed up. And it was a week and a half notice, and there's a cultural thing there, for sure, and they need to have a meeting on site. And it turns out that you can only use the community room there if you're a resident there.
Yeah. Because
I wanted to organize for Maria Reyes. She's one of the lead activists at Reed-Hillview, fighting against the continued injustice up there with the lead. They want to bring the lead back. The pilots are trying to bring the lead back because some guy said his engine failed. One guy out of thousands. And so anyway, Maria Reyes would be the perfect person to have on a Zoom call there. but I would like to have it at the community center. So if anybody's listening, can reserve the community center at San Lazaro. Get a hold of Philip.
Okay.
But what was I talking about before? Anyway, I don't know if we're done here or not.
I think at 93 minutes we're gonna have troubles getting people to listen to the whole thing.
Yeah. Maybe you can break it up into 2 45ers.
Yeah, maybe.
Anyway, I appreciate you coming out. Is there anything that you want to say, or you're kind of asking me all the questions? But
yeah, I got involved with this purely from the housing angle at first, and I just really was so glad that, and maybe we can do another episode about the airport neighborhood campaign. But I was so glad that we had this coalition of neighbors of the airport, housing advocates, and it's interesting, and others, and it's interesting the different kinds of people you meet along the way. Some of them are kind of under the radar, paying close attention to these issues. And we've mentioned Bree Lehman, who's just an encyclopedia and of all things local municipal airports, and just some really passionate, lovely people that I've gotten to meet, and it's just been really lovely to be in your house. You're not a crank, you're not someone who's just upset because it happens to be over your house. Like, there's some real social justice issues going on here that I appreciate. I applaud you for making noise, because this affects a lot of people.
Yeah, and what I've really learned about is how government works.
Yeah.
And you would think it's a cliche, right? But it really is these little outside centers of power, and then threat of the budget that kind of, could puts constraints on their behavior. And somebody like Cindy Chavez from Reed-Hillview in Santa Clara County is a rare administrator, because she's like, you know what? We'll take the lawsuit. I don't know if Boulder would do that. And they're just, I wouldn't say it's a courage issue. They're just like, I would think it would be big enough because of the health effects that we're getting hammered with, but maybe, like anything, there's just not enough people yet yelling about it.
Yeah.
And and that's another issue is,
there's a lot going on in the world.
You just need something like what they did in Maribor, Slovenia, where they set up citizens' assemblies around the town, and they became a parallel government, and it was non-ideological. It was only based on the performance of the government, and they had meetings, and it was consensus-based, and if the city went against what the population wanted, then they went to direct action.
They had political,
and they did.
For that.
It wasn't through the parliamentary procedure, and I kind of think almost every town and county in the country needs something like that.
Yeah, well,
because we're not really representative.
Yeah,
because you get people get elected, and then they do what they think is right instead of coordinating what their constituents want, and that's sort of the fundamental flaw that maybe this could help. But that's another issue.
That's a whole other thing. I mean, this is part of why I care so much about the structure and the bones of our city, because we have such a dearth of public places. We have such a poverty of civic engagement. And I mean, if we had a sizable percentage of us paying attention and gathering together and discussing the issues. I mean, I know I'm not saying democracy is dead in Boulder County. It's probably more alive here than a lot of other places, but it's I feel like we're trending in the wrong direction.
It's like everywhere, but like when the country was started, it was never representative. It was for the special interests, and they've always had sway, and there's no difference today. It's just sometimes the special interests may be nicer for the general population, sometimes not. And that's kind of what I think we should work to replace with something that is truly democratic. But that's a lot of work.
So much work.
But if people are really involved and what they say means something,
Yeah.
And like let's say widening Iris was the issue. I saw some things on Nextdoor about that, and people are like pulling their hair out, like, why would the city do this? Well, maybe that would be something if all the little groups around the city knew that they could change that, if not because they voted for somebody, because who knows what their connections are. But yeah, representation should not mean I'm doing what I was elected to do what I think is best. It should mean, all right, I'm going to go out and talk to my constituents and see what they want me to do. That would be like a coordination class, but we don't have that. We have to a degree, but not really. So, but like I said, that's
that was a grand slam closer.
Now people, you're gonna have to start elbowing and get them to awake here.
All right. Thank you for participating. Really appreciate
thanks, Phil, for coming over.
Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.